Welcome to Aviation Republic. On a fateful day, June 18th, 1972, a Trident Gulf Alpha Romeo Papa India, or simply Papa India, took off from a wet, overcast, blustery Heathrow Airport. This was a routine flight bound for Brussels. Little did the passengers and crew know that within moments of takeoff, a series of events would unfold, leading to a horrific turn of events. To this day, over 50 years later, this incident still raises many questions. Was the captain mentally and physically unfit to fly? Was the second officer too inexperienced and fearful to act? Did anger, misunderstandings, miscommunication, and intimidation lead to warnings being ignored and critical flight control and safety systems being disabled, all leading to the jet plummeting from the sky? In this video, we examine the story of British European Airways Flight 548 and how a toxic cockpit environment changed air travel in the UK forever. The Trident. In 1972, British European Airways operated international routes within Europe. To service these destinations, the airline operated the pride of Britain's domestic aerospace industry, the Hawker Siddeley HS-121 Trident jet, designed to compete against the Boeing 727 and the McDonnell Douglas DC-9. The Trident was at the time one of the fastest subsonic swept-wing aircraft in the world. She sported 3 rear-mounted Rolls-Royce Spey engines surrounding the T-tail, 2 inside fuselage pods, and the third engine in the fuselage tail cone. The S-shaped air intake came out above in front of the tail fin. The layout of the 3 engines and T-tail would play a significant role in the events that would transpire later. She was also fitted with multiple triple redundant systems, along with some of the most sophisticated avionics systems available for the time that proved highly effective during its operational life. These systems featured a fully automated blind landing system that allowed the aircraft to automatically fly the landing approach, flare, touchdown, and even roll out from the landing runway. As you can imagine, the ability to land in fog solved a significant challenge at London Heathrow and other British and European airports. Previously, delays or redirects to other airports were frequent, which would be costly for airlines and inconvenient for passengers, but not for BEA Tridents. The Trident's advanced avionics also included a moving map display on the center instrument panel, which provided real-time information on the aircraft's position relative to the ground. This electromechanical device used a stylus to plot the aircraft's track on a motor-driven paper map. Positional data was sourced from a Doppler navigation system, which captured ground speed drift information and heading data to guide the stylus. The various systems are mentioned so that we may appreciate that this was a reasonably advanced passenger jet for the time, and pilots who flew her needed to be well trained and highly competent. Pilots, as a breed, like to get their hands on the controls to keep their skills sharp, but as it happened, not all pilots at BEA felt that they were getting their fair share of time at the helm, which led to resentment. At the time of the incident, British European Airways was experiencing significant workplace turmoil. Around that time, the International Federation of Airline Pilots Association announced a worldwide protest strike against aircraft hijacking, which had become more frequent in the 1970s. Expecting support, the British Airline Pilots Association, or simply BALPA, asked the pilots of BEA if they wanted to strike. And because of this pending strike and wishing to avoid disruption, many travelers changed their travel plans, and as a result, Flight 548 was full. However, regardless of the potential strike action and solidarity with the International Federation of Airline Pilots Association, BALPA was already in a long-standing dispute about wages and working conditions with BEA. Typically, most pay disputes affect relations between management and pilots, but in this instance, they also affected the relations between the airline's pilots. At the time, a group of 22 BEA co-pilots was already on strike. These 22 co-pilots were also expected to fulfill the role of supervisory first officers. The role of the supervisory first officers was to sit in the third seat, or P3, and assist the captain and co-pilot who handled the aircraft. In other airlines, the role of the SFO/P3 was handled by the flight engineer. This meant that the limited role of the P3 denied them flight time at the controls, which led to a loss of pay that they resented. This created an anomaly in which less experienced co-pilots were flying the aircraft. This situation also upset many captains, who preferred to have the co-pilot and flight engineer swap places after every flight, but could not do so when assigned second officers who were only partially qualified. The Dublin Incident. On the 15th of June 1972, just a few days before Flight 548 took off, another BEA flight to Nicosia, crewed by a senior captain, was rostered to fly with one co-pilot who was trained as P2/P3 and one who was only trained as P2. The flight was scheduled to fly first to Dublin, return to Heathrow, and then to Nicosia. Although the meteorological reports were favourable for Nicosia, the captain knew the weather conditions could change rapidly. Although the airport's landing facilities were considered adequate, they were not as good as those at other airfields. As a result, the captain would have preferred to have the more experienced co-pilot in the P2 seat, i.e. the one trained as P2 and P3. Unfortunately for the captain, this was not possible since the less experienced co-pilot was not qualified to act as P3. The captain, hoping to remedy the problem as he saw it, went to see the aircrew controller, who refused to give him a replacement. He was told it was the captain's duty to fly as rostered, and that he would breach his contract if he didn't. In other words, fly or you're fired. The captain, upset by the ultimatum, returned to the crew room and spoke to the P2 in terms he certainly would not have used otherwise, suggesting to the young man that he would be useless in an emergency. Although the captain had no recollection of saying anything offensive, there is no doubt that the P2 was very upset and that his confidence was damaged. So much so that during the takeoff and noise abatement phase out of Heathrow, the P2 mistakenly put the flaps fully down instead of up. The P3 immediately saw what was happening and reversed the action. Fortunately, the flaps had not time to travel any significant distance. It just so happened that the P2 in the Dublin incident shared a house with 22-year-old second officer Jeremy Keighley, who was assigned to the crew of British European Airways Flight 548, and told him what had happened. Keighley himself, a second officer with incomplete flight engineer training, who had only joined BEA a month and a half earlier with just 29 hours as P2 under his belt, would have sympathized with his colleague, and may have considered the sentiment the captain had held about his colleague to be held by other senior captains, which was that all P2s were useless. You can imagine how, as a young pilot, it must have had an impression on him and his confidence. This incident was the sort of gossip that would have travelled quickly around the crew room, and 51-year-old Captain Stanley Key and Second Officer Simon Ticehurst, aged 24, with 1,400 hours, including 750 hours on Tridents, made up the rest of Flight 548's crew, were undoubtedly aware of its details. Crew room tensions. Captain Stanley Key was one of the old guards at BEA, having accumulated over 15,000 hours, 4,000 of them on Tridents, had served with the Royal Air Force as a pilot during the Second World War, and it may have been from this background that he, like many older pilots, viewed flying as a passion, and felt a sense of duty to the company, which must be put first, to be ardently against strike action, whereas the younger pilots viewed flying simply as a career. This generational divide resulted in lively debates in the BEA crew room. However, his views on the strike may also have made him more than a few enemies on the airline. About an hour and a half before the departure of Flight 548, Captain Key was in the BEA crew room with many other pilots. It seems that Captain Key, who was, as previously mentioned, opposed to pilots taking strike action, had been canvassing the support of some of his fellow senior captains when he was approached by a first officer named Flavel, who asked how his efforts were progressing. This question provoked an outburst from Captain Key, who told First Officer Flavel that the matter was confidential. At least one eyewitness described this outburst as the most violent argument he had ever heard, although it seems to have been less of an argument than a one-sided expression of views. Whichever it was, Captain Keyes was plainly furious indeed, but it subsided as quickly as it had erupted, and the captain took the first officer by the arm and apologized for what he had said. Afterwards, he seemed to be his usual self. However, Jeremy Keighley, who was soon to fly for the first time with Keyes as P2, was a witness to this incident. How much of an effect seeing his captain lose his temper had on him during the critical moments of the flight, it could not have been beneficial. The graffiti. It seemed that Captain Key was not popular among the younger pilots, and offensive scribbles and graffiti were discovered on the P3 table in India Papa, some of the remarks targeting Captain Keyes and some of them at the BEA management. Early on, when the investigators were collecting evidence, the remarks on the table seemed to indicate that a dispute had occurred between the three pilots prior to or during the flight. Handwriting experts examined the graffiti to determine whether it was Simon Ticehurst's or Jeremy Keighley's, and concluded that Ticehurst may have been responsible. The flight. The crew boarded the aircraft at 15:20 to begin preparing for the flight, which was scheduled to depart at 15:45. However, at 15:36, a flight dispatcher boarded the flight just as Key was about to order the doors to close, asking him to take on an extra 3 BEA Flight crew members and fly them to Brussels. One of the 3 they took on board was another senior BEA pilot, Captain John Collins, who took the P4 seat next to Ticehurst, who sat in the P3 observer position. Adding the 3 new passengers required some of the cargo to be removed from the aircraft to ensure its total weight did not exceed the permitted maximum. This caused the departure time to be pushed back from 15:45 to 1600, which probably did nothing to improve Captain Key's mood. To make matters worse, the weather that day was not great. There was a cold front approaching southeastwards across England with complete cloud cover sitting at 1,000 feet, with small amounts at 600 feet. The surface wind was 210 degrees at 17 knots with driving rain, and there was considerable turbulence within the clouds. And it would be in these conditions that the crew of Flight 548 would be flying without any visual reference. Still, despite the weather conditions, it was nothing outside the capacity of the aircraft. So here we are, and the stage is set. We have a relatively complex aircraft crewed by a possibly irritated captain as the pilot flying, an inexperienced pilot as P2 is pilot monitoring, who may have felt quite intimidated by his superior at this stage, and a potentially disgruntled supervisory pilot in P3, whose job it was to supervise and oversee actions of both P1 and P2. It was a situation the captain of the Dublin Incident had feared, to be caught flying in difficult conditions with an inexperienced P2. With the doors finally closing at 15:58, the pushback was requested at 1600. 3 minutes later, the Trident started a taxi towards departure runway 28R for takeoff. At 16:06, the crew received their departure route during the taxi, known as the Dover 1 Standard Instrument Departure. At this point, you may be wondering why the second-by-second timestamps are relevant. This is to emphasize how rapidly the situation deteriorated on the flight deck. The Trident rolled onto the runway configured for takeoff, and at 16:08:30, the brakes were released. The standard BEA practice for Heathrow departures for this particular flight involved a takeoff with 20-degree trailing edge flaps deployed and extending leading edge droop slats. Regarding the takeoff configuration for the Trident 1, as mentioned previously, the Trident was one of the fastest subsonic commercial airliners, able to cruise at over 610 miles an hour. However, this came at a cost. Her wings were built for speed and produced relatively limited lift at lower speeds, and to create additional lift, she was to be the first British civil aircraft fitted with retractable leading-edge high-lift devices called Droops. Typically, conventional trailing-edge flaps extend out from the wing's rear and provide additional lift at lower speeds during takeoff and landings, but trailing-edge flaps were not sufficient for the Trident, and therefore mechanisms called Droops were fitted to increase wing area and provide additional lift. In simple terms, Droops are hinged at the bottom of the leading edge, move outwards from the top of the wing, and extend downwards when deployed. If these Droops are retracted too soon at low speeds, the wing would not be able to provide enough lift, and the aircraft will head into a stall. The takeoff was normal. Captain Key rotated at 42 seconds, and 2 seconds later lifted the Trident from the tarmac at 145 knots. At 63 seconds, the autopilot was engaged 355 feet above the runway at 170 knots. At 74 seconds, the aircraft started a 20-degree banked turn towards a non-directional beacon or NDB radio navigation aid. At 83 seconds, Captain Key reported climbing is cleared, and was instructed by Heathrow ATC to change the frequency and contact the London ATC Centre. At 16:10, the noise abatement procedure was initiated. This required planes to climb out of Heathrow to reduce engine power for a specified time, starting at 90 seconds after takeoff. Noise abatement was taken seriously by the authorities, who monitored power reduction to ensure that regulations were followed, putting significant pressure on the pilots to get their timings right. Working on the assumption that Captain Key was the pilot flying would involve Keighley keeping track of time on a stopwatch until power reduction. At 93 seconds, the trailing edge flaps were moved from their 20-degree takeoff setting to fully up, and the power was reduced. During the turn, with the flaps up, the speed reduced to 157 knots, 20 knots below the target speed of 177 knots. At 103 seconds, the ATC cleared Papa India to flight level 60, which Captain Key acknowledged with the terse call-up up to 60. This also happened to be the last message received from Papa India. When investigators examined Ticehurst's log, they found that he had duly entered this clearance up to the flight level 60. In any other routine flight, they would have climbed to 3,000 feet, restored normal climb power, and accelerated to 225 knots, and then it would have been safe to retract the Droops. However, at 114 seconds, with an airspeed of only 162 knots and climbing through 1,772 feet, the lever to retract the Droops was inexplicably selected up. If you recall, the purpose of the Droops is to provide lift at low speeds. In essence, they decrease the speed at which the plane will stall, enabling flight at lower speeds, and should never have been retracted below 225 knots. But as the Droops started to slowly retract, they began to rob the jet of the vital lift they had been providing. Then, at 116 seconds, without warning, the Trident stall recovery system kicked in by simultaneously engaging the stick shaker, the stick pusher, and a stall warner that sounded like this. The stick pusher shoved the control columns forward, pitching the nose of the aircraft down to increase the speed. As you can imagine, the sound of the stall warning and the stick shaker would have come as a shock to the crew. The large forward movement of the control column caused the autopilot to disengage, transmitting another audio warning to each of the pilot's headsets along with flashing red alert lamps. The autopilot warning horn continued to sound for the remainder of the flight. It was with the sudden cacophony of alarms and lights that the pilots attempted to work the problem. To make matters worse, because the Trident was in a climb, the moment the autopilot was disengaged, the elevator trim was still in the climb position, pushing the tail down and the nose up. In effect, the aircraft was trimmed into the stall. However, rather than following stall recovery procedures, the wings were leveled and the aircraft nose pitched up. Despite this, at 124 seconds, the Trident system attempted to push the nose down again, followed by a third attempt at 127 seconds. After the third time, someone on the flight deck decided to disable the system by pulling the stick pusher override handle. Having decided that the stall warnings were false despite the massive warnings, as far as Captain Key and Keighley seemed to be concerned, their attention was focused on the airspeed indicator, an attitude indicator, believing that they were still flying at a safe speed. At 128 seconds, the aircraft pitched up rapidly and entered a true aerodynamic stall, and then a deep stall at 133 seconds, from which, at a height of only 1,200 feet, it had lost any chance of recovery. With its nose pitched up by 31 degrees, caused the tail control surfaces to become ineffective, as they were in the turbulent zone of the stalled wings. Once the tail surfaces became ineffective, recovery from the stall would have been impossible, and the Trident fell out of the sky, plummeting 4,500 feet per minute and coming down almost vertically. At no point did it seem that any of the flight crew took any action to recover, as the Trident dropped straight down, narrowly missing high-tension overhead power lines, and crashed onto a narrow strip of land surrounded by tall trees immediately south of the A30 road, on the outskirts of the small town of Staines. The Trident's fuselage shattered into multiple sections, with the tail planting itself into the ground at the point of impact, a mere 150 seconds after takeoff. Trevor Burke, aged 13, witnessed the crash and alerted a neighbor, Mrs. Castledine, a trained nurse. She was the first to arrive at the scene and was confronted by a mass of tangled wreckage and deceased. She found one person, Irish businessman Melvin Miller, who was still alive, although unconscious. Still, his injuries were such from the force of the impact that he passed away shortly after having been taken to Ashford Hospital. None of the 118 passengers and crew survived, making BEA Flight 548 Britain's deadliest plane crash ever at the time, and was surpassed by the Lockerbie bombing in 1988. A year later, Mrs. Castledine would be appointed an MBE for gallantry for her efforts on the day. The investigation. At the time of the accident, the Trident was equipped with 2 flight data recorders, which allowed investigators to determine pretty quickly that the Droops had been retracted too early, which caused the stall. But however valuable they were in providing data, they did not provide a complete picture. Unfortunately, at the time, British law did not require passenger aircraft to be fitted with cockpit voice recorders, so investigators were left in the dark as to why the Droops had been retracted, who had retracted them, who had turned off the stall protection system, and why the pilot monitoring, in this instance, Ticehurst, had failed to intervene. Answering these questions the investigators knew was going to be a challenge. The investigators were able to establish who was flying Papa India. They found that Captain Key's seat was in the notch where one would expect it to be had he been the handling pilot. Upon examination of various switches on the flight deck, such as the compass switch, which was turned to port, it was suggested that Captain Key was flying. So if he was flying, the question was how such an experienced captain with no record of any previous incidents could make such a series of basic handling mistakes, and why Ticehurst, who was supposed to be monitoring, did not alert the crew of the issues. Unfit for service. Although the aircraft was destroyed, the fact that there was no fire on impact meant that the bodies of the flight crew were recovered, and it was the autopsy of Captain Key that revealed a likely cause for the inexplicable actions. Despite Captain Key presenting to those who knew him a picture of good health, he was suffering from a condition known as atherosclerosis. In simple terms, atherosclerosis is a condition that causes a buildup of fibrous or fatty tissues in the walls of major arteries. In the autopsy, 3 of his coronary arteries each showed severe atherosclerosis throughout their entire length. At the time of his death, the diameter of the arteries had been reduced by 50 to 70%. Also discovered in the autopsy was a tear in the arterial wall. This happens when the arterial lining thickens, forming small blood vessels in the new tissue. However, these new blood vessels are not robust, and if there is a sharp rise in the pressure of the blood flowing through the vessels, they would be prone to rupture, and the resulting pressure of the hemorrhage could, in turn, force part of the artery wall to separate. Although he might not have noticed at first, the tear, unlikely to cause heart failure, death, or total incapacitation, would have caused pain, which would have escalated noticeably as he finished pre-flight checks, boarded the Trident, and prepared for the flight to Brussels. Pathologists were able to tell from the color and composition of the blood that the bleeding which had resulted from the hemorrhage had started not more than 2 hours before the crash. The question that investigators started asking was, what were the likely causes of the increase in blood pressure and the consequent hemorrhage? On that day, there was no shortage of events that would have irritated Captain Keighley. Maybe the fact that he was called into work on a Sunday, perhaps he saw the graffiti on the flight deck, or the unexpected delay before takeoff. But the most likely cause for the increase in blood pressure was the argument in the crew room. Since this took place about an hour and a half before the takeoff, it is not unreasonable to suppose that it may have been the cause of the rise in blood pressure. Who knows if that day would have turned out differently had First Officer Flavel not questioned Captain Keighley in the crew room. In his state, he would have felt pain in his chest, along with the reduced flow of blood and oxygen to his brain, which would have impaired his ability to operate the aircraft. Therefore, Keighley most likely retracted the droops while attempting to retract the flaps. The levers to retract the flaps and operate the droops are situated next to each other on the central console, and in his subtly incapacitated state, he may have reached across and operated the incorrect lever. Droops. However, engineers understood early in the aircraft's history that there might be confusion between the flap and droop levers. To prevent the pilot, in the stress of the moment, from retracting the droops instead of the flaps, the Tridents had been fitted with a mechanism that guarded the droop lever from being moved if the flaps were deployed beyond 7 degrees. But if the trailing edge flaps had been raised beforehand, nothing would have prevented the droops from being moved. And it just so happened that Second Officer Keighley likely retracted the flaps, leaving the droop lever unguarded. Investigators also had to explain why Keighley and Ticehurst did nothing to counter the low airspeed, the retraction of the droops, or the stall. Ticehurst's purpose was to be alert enough to observe errors, and have the experience and confidence to correct them when he saw them. It's possible that he was either distracted by Captain Collins or was not paying sufficient attention. Had he noticed the low speed, it was his duty to be literally screaming, "Speed, speed," over the intercom. For Keighley's part, even though he was the co-pilot, he was still very young, had only 29 hours on the Trident, and had recently witnessed his captain to lose his temper with a first officer for the simple act of asking a question, and very likely felt intimidated and wanted to avoid crossing Captain Keighley at all costs. As strange as it sounds, even amid the emergency, he may have felt overwhelmed by the situation and did not have the experience, knowledge, or authority to offer advice or assistance to his captain. Additionally, Keighley may have been distracted by counting down the seconds to the noise abatement procedure, and he may not have seen the droop lever being moved due to his armrest blocking the view. The pilot's failure to recover from the stall also had a logical explanation. Unlike a typical stall where the aircraft's speed decreases past the stall speed, in this case, the stall occurred when the stall speed suddenly increased beyond the aircraft speed when the droops were retracted. This led to simultaneous activation of the stick shaker and stick pusher, a deviation from the usual sequence where the stick pusher kicks in after a delay following the activation of the stick shaker. Typically, the stick shaker warns of an impending stall before the stick pusher engages at the stall speed. However, in this instance, the aircraft entered a stall immediately after the droops were retracted, causing what is colloquially termed a change in configuration stall. This particular stall type, not covered in airline training, likely caught the pilots off guard. They may have mistaken the stick pusher's response for a malfunction, prompting them to deactivate it using the emergency override handle, ultimately leading to the stall. Faulty equipment. Additionally, there were reports and incidents in which Trident pilots questioned the reliability of the stick shaker and stick pusher. While approximately half of the known stick pusher activations on the Tridents were false, none had occurred in the 6.5 years before the crash. Some pilots even speculated that the stick pusher could activate autonomously and nosedive the aircraft, although this notion was unfounded. The skepticism likely influenced the flight crew of Flight 548 dismissal of the stall warnings, since there was no change in airspeed and the stick pusher seemed to be behaving erratically. Trust in it was minimal. As we know, their assumption was flawed, and once the aircraft entered the deep stall, there was little time to prevent the fatal crash. Angry graffiti. The recovery of the flight engineer's tray table amidst the wreckage, adorned with disparaging remarks aimed at Captain Key, prompted investigators to explore the possibility of an altercation between the pilots during the flight. However, a handwriting analysis indicated that the messages were unlikely to have been penned by anyone aboard Flight 48. Still, maybe Ticehurst was responsible for one of them. Although Ticehurst held the same views as Captain Key on matters regarding the strike, investigators concluded that the graffiti was not the product of anyone aboard Papa India that day. Even if Captain Key had seen the graffiti, it probably wouldn't have provoked more than an acid comment. So what initially appeared to be evidence of something more sinister was no more than an exercise in puerility, which could be found repeated in several BEA aircraft. It was feasible to explain the crash without suggesting there was an onboard dispute. Nonetheless, the underlying discord among British European Airways pilots undoubtedly contributed to a cockpit environment lacking the level of cooperation and teamwork we expect from a modern aircrew drilled in crew resource management operations. The prevailing mistrust between senior pilots like Key and younger pilots like Keighley created a company culture where pilots felt they couldn't rely on one another. Keighley. Keighley, in particular, only 22, had only been flying for a short time and was initially believed to be responsible for moving the droop lever, which led investigators to carefully examine his training records, which showed that he grappled with self-doubt, as testified by his trainers, who acknowledged his potential as a competent pilot, but noted he was slow to learn and hesitant in emergencies, coupled with a lack of initiative, and that stress might cause him difficulties. Despite what some might think, the high standards and keen intelligence required for pilot training were not that of the average young man of 22. And much to his credit, he succeeded by sheer determination to pass his training, although one of his instructors reported he will need careful watching. Consequently, the responsibility of addressing the emergency primarily fell on Captain Key, who at that time was medically unfit to captain the jet. After piecing together the events, investigators questioned if the crash could have been averted. The answer? Perhaps. Medical experts concurred that Key's cardiovascular health likely wouldn't have raised red flags before the fatal incident. However, concerning operational aspects, several previous events have already highlighted the potential danger of mistakenly handling the incorrect lever. The Foxtrot Hotel Incident. In the Foxtrot Hotel incident of 1970, a strikingly similar chain of events nearly unfolded with another BEA Trident. Pilots claimed that a spontaneous uncommanded retraction of the leading-edge slats had occurred, or in layman's terms, the leading-edge slats retracted on their own, simultaneously triggering the stick shaker and stick pusher. Fortunately, the pilots detected the slat retraction and prevented a stall. Despite attributing the event to mechanical failure, no issues could be found with the slat system. Investigators speculated that the captain, in contravention of standard procedures, had initially wanted to retract the flaps after takeoff to enhance climb performance, which was a violation of standard operating procedures. Then inadvertently retracted the slats instead. The first officer noticed and immediately remedied the problem by re-extending the retracted slats, and the flight continued normally. Investigations into the event found no mechanical malfunction that could have caused the premature leading-edge device retraction, and stated that the aircraft had just about managed to stay flying. Following the Foxtrot Hotel incident, the same captain made the same error in a similar situation departing from the Orly Airport in Paris. Once more, the captain wanted to retract the flaps during the climb and adjusted the droop lever instead. However, the first officer, aware of the captain's tendency, promptly re-extended the droops and pushed the nose down to prevent the stick shaker and pusher from activating. Regrettably, the first officer refrained from formally reporting the incident, fearing repercussions for the captain. Concerns were raised. Several efforts to raise concerns about the incident had been disregarded. BEA's general manager of flight operations had advocated reopening the investigation into the Foxtrot Hotel incident out of concern for a potential major accident stemming from premature droop retraction. Unfortunately, this request was overlooked. Another captain had alerted the airline to the widespread belief among pilots that a stick pusher activation indicated a malfunction, not a stall. Nonetheless, this captain, known for constantly reporting problems, akin to the boy who cried wolf, was ignored. Maybe if this captain had been heard, who knows? Studies carried out into pilot incapacitation should have triggered industry-wide concern. Crew members are supposed to detect even subtle signs of the captain's incapacity. However, simulator trials conducted in the United States in 1971 revealed that 25% of incidents where the captain became unexpectedly incapacitated during takeoff or landing resulted in a crash. In the remaining 75%, it took 30 seconds to 4 minutes for other crew members to realize and respond. This fundamentally changed the notion that the captain's incapacitation would be immediately evident to the rest of the crew, suggesting a need for potential new training in this area. At that time, the only training pilots had received was for total incapacitation, where it was obvious that the captain was completely incapacitated. It seems strange to us today, but the hierarchy of the flight deck during this time meant that the captain was akin to God, and God must never be questioned. Conclusion. In its conclusive report, the AIB issued several recommendations to prevent a recurrence of a similar accident. These suggestions included installing a bulk to avoid the droop lever from shifting to the retracted position. If the aircraft speed is too low, providing training to pilots on change of configuration stalls and their impact on the stick shaker and stick pusher, training pilots to identify even subtle signs of incapacitation in other crew members, offering trainee pilots more flight deck exposure before allowing them to fly without supervision, keeping the cockpit jump seat unoccupied during critical flight stages, and granting BEA's head of safety more authority, among other proposals. More crucially, the AIB proposed that all British aircraft to be equipped with cockpit voice recorders, a requirement already in place in the US and Australia, but not yet mandatory in Britain. In a candid evaluation of their capabilities, the AIB acknowledged that without a cockpit voice recorder, they couldn't definitively confirm the accuracy of their analysis of the crew's actions. The presence of a recorder might have led them to explore entirely different lines of inquiry. However, the Final Lane report released in 1973, which you can find in the description, concluded that the immediate cause of the crash were the handling pilot's failures to achieve and maintain adequate speed and retraction of the droops 60 knots below the proper speed, causing the aircraft to enter a stall along with the crew failing to monitor the speed error. But the questions remain to this day. Did an altercation occur on board? Did Captain Key notice the graffiti, and what effect did it have on him? Did anyone endeavor to alert Key about his low speed? Regrettably, these questions will forever remain unanswered. Still, as a result of the recommendations in the Lane report, cockpit voice recorders became mandatory on all British airliners for the first time. Henceforth, investigations into plane crashes on British soil would no longer contend with such limited information.